Welcome back, everybody, for the final session for the day. It's been another big day here at Newkind Conference. Great to see so many of you staying here for the last session. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our next presentation back to Newkind after speaking at Newkind 2020. Hoda Afshar is an artist, educator, lecturer of visual arts, an advocate for human rights who uses her skills and her expertise to impact social change and advocate for the rights of those who are oppressed and underprivileged. She is a Tehran-born Iranian-Australian artist who I came across her work a few years ago when I heard about her trip to Manus, where she snuck into the island and managed to get into the detention center and spend several weeks with the men at that stage who were still locked up and imprisoned for seeking asylum to Australia. And it was I think the sheer hopelessness of the situation. Some men who were talking about wanting to even throw up at the side of the ocean because that's all they've been able to see for so many years, locked up on that island. That's inspired her to take that series of portraits that then, obviously led to her acclaim, and she became quite well known for that portrait that she took of Behrouz Boochani that we are all quite familiar with. Today, however, we are going to be looking at some of another piece of Hoda's work, Agonistes, which is the film that came as an outcome of or in parallel to the photography exhibition, where she spoke with and sat with and learned about the stories of 9 whistleblowers of different various forms of oppression or corruption and injustice that have been happening, and deciding to take their portraits in a very, very new way, which we're going to discuss in a moment. And then the documentary that came out of that to share their stories, which was done in a very interesting way as well. We're going to watch Agonistes in a second before Hoda actually comes up, and I wanted to read you something about Agonistes first, if I haven't already lost my tab. It's here, it's just a different tab. So as part of the International Photography Festival of Melbourne, that this piece was commissioned, and it was looking at acts of whistleblowing aimed at calling attention to the alleged wrongdoings and misconduct of government organisations in Australia. And she wanted to, I'm not going to go into that because we're going to talk about that together. I think I've probably explained enough, because if I go any further, then I'll probably ruin it for you. I won't say any more. We're going to watch this film first. Then we're going to welcome Hoda with a round of applause to the stage. So without any further ado, could we please dim the lights and play the film, and then we'll welcome Hoda.
It'll probably have to go down. This one? Do you want me to on this side? It's interesting, that idea of weight and that weight that you carry, because my experience is perhaps a little different to carrying weight. My job, in order to stay alive, has to be to feel enough weight to stay on the earth. Because what happens to me is that I fracture. It's like 50 parts of me just fracture and disintegrate, and I fly. I'm not on the ground. I'm in the air. I'm all over the place, and I'm not connected. It's almost a weightlessness that happens. That weight of responsibility fractures me, I guess. The weight of carrying that fractures, I guess I break under it.
I remember thinking, do they have a file on me? Am I known now? You know, the potential for people to be investigating me behind the scenes was real, and my lawyer told me that they will be looking into you, and the only thing protecting you is the public and the media.
It's just impossible for the rational mind to comprehend how anything like that could happen here. It's just more than I can understand, sometimes more than I can cope with.
You'd be a bit like being married to someone who is accused of being a serial killer or something, and you believe in them. The more you hear, the more suspicious you get. And then eventually, when you hear one too many things which doesn't make sense, you maybe begin to think that maybe you're on the wrong side.
I've never done anything like this before. This is not something that people involve themselves in on a daily basis. People who go to work and make a living don't contact the media to tell a story. I was just in extreme panic about what was possibly going to be happening. My heart was pounding. I was determined to get this story out. The relief that came over me was a breath.
It was probably about a year and a half that I went through this period of going to work and having to, you know, sneak out to have a panic attack, and then going back into work, sneaking out to talk to someone from the media to feel more ethically okay and connected. I think when you are required to do things in secret, the whole problem that you're trying to expose is that things are being done in secret. It creates this inevitable tension.
It was hard for me to make a complaint because I knew it would be the end of my career, and I knew it wasn't. It was unlikely to end well, but I knew I had to. They knew that they couldn't answer my complaint because I had the law on my side. And so what they did was they starved my complaint of oxygen. In the meantime, they try to marginalise you. You've become a problem.
I guess you can say I'm a senior lawyer. I've been Attorney General, and I face a trial at some stage in the dock that I've faced as a lawyer defending people in jury trials and other hearings all my career. I'm unable to speak about those events. What I can relate is how I've been treated as a lawyer, providing legal advice to the best of my ability.
I was the lawyer for the Special Forces, which meant I did a lot of secret work. All soldiers, whether they want to admit it, their honour is more important than their life.
I remember one of the policemen coming to me and saying, "Oh, your grandfather, he's a very dignified, good man." And that really brought into the whole way that he had represented himself. He and other people involved were good, decent, religious men.
I worked in disability accommodation. I began to see things that I knew weren't right. People were basically placed in there as babies and were neglected to the point that they didn't have physio, they didn't have range of motion therapy for their joints, so they had fused joints, they had distorted bodies, twisted bodies, displaced organs. For the most part, they were people who could not even push anyone away that was hurting them.
I saw an ad on Facebook to go overseas for a working holiday in the Pacific, and I thought that was really cool at the time. I rang the number listed on the ad and they sent me to Nauru within 3 days. The job description didn't provide any detail into what we were actually going to be doing there. We thought that it was a working holiday and sort of like an adventure. We knew that we'd be working with refugees, but we weren't really even sure what a refugee was at that stage.
We went into a room. There was a homemade box made of plywood and that was shabbily put together. I asked the team leader, what was that? And he said to me, that's where we put people. And my heart sank.
Men had ultimate power and were also given access to children. Children were, pieces of property that could be used in whatever way the men, whether they were related to or not, wanted. What am I saying? My grandfather, so in his area, he was the main person. And we used to refer to him as God. It was like he was God.
Seeing a client who was totally helpless, had his face scrubbed with a Scotch-Brite pad that you would scrub saucepans with. She would give non-prescribed medications, and one of the clients died of respiratory failure a couple of weeks after having neat bleach, white king, poured into her mouth.
You would see people screaming, running around, pacing, yelling, crying. And when you saw a sort of big incident like that, for me, I felt this real tightness in my chest watching somebody else cut themselves or watching somebody else hang themselves.
We dropped a lot of bombs. We shot a lot of people up. We forgot, because it was convenient to forget, that was a government decision to send soldiers to war.
You've got to be in my shoes to understand this form of vindictive retribution that's being meted out to me. It's a lonely business made worse by laws passed after 9/11 that was meant to deal with terrorists. Those laws, in great irony, are being used against me.
There's always a difficulty around being believed, and it's part of the power of the silence that is instilled in you when you are someone who has been abused from a really early age, is that you need to stay silent and you need to protect the abusers.
I became really concerned that, that there would be a death and that a child would die in detention while I was representing them. There was one child who was incredibly articulate, and that young person transformed from being a person I could have those kind of conversations with to someone who talked about the white devils in the prison, who became increasingly violent in the way he talked about the guards and talked about white people in general, because he had been so beaten down by the conditions in youth detention.
From my earlier experiences, I remember that time, my brother, and him explaining to me the involuntary nature of abuse. And it struck me. I knew what he was saying. I knew it. I didn't want to believe it. No one wants to believe this. But I knew what he was saying. And I said, I don't know what you're saying. Please explain. What do you mean?
I remember one time a man was on hunger strike for 56 days and he looked like a skeleton, and he was wearing these blue pajamas that were just draping off his body. He started to walk to the front gate and he collapsed, and I thought, I can't be here and not record what's happening. I felt that it was so important to bear witness and record and keep a diary of the things that I was seeing, because it almost felt that people wouldn't believe it.
I use that word active blindness quite a bit because of my idea of it is that, as opposed to active listening, where you are deeply listening, there is an active blindness which determinedly doesn't listen and doesn't see. You are often shut down, not just by the powers that you expect to shut you down, but by those that you expect to support you or to further that cause. That's one of the most frustrating and the most heartbreaking and debilitating things, I think, is when you actually become vilified on all sides.
All of the children in detention in Alice Springs for the 3 years that I was there were Aboriginal. I think during the time that I worked in the Territory, there was one non-Aboriginal child imprisoned during that period.
I would say that was the beginning of my post-traumatic stress disorder. It was as though I was shell-shocked and I couldn't help myself because I just could not believe what had happened. I had thyroid cancer, and I've had 2 surgeries on that. I believe that because I was silenced, they used confidentiality to keep me quiet all those years, as well as all the other things.
It's hard to actually do something against the system because at that stage I felt physically threatened. I thought something was going to happen to my safety, and there was nothing that I could do within the system to help these people. And that's when I started collecting incident reports and different documents and buying hidden cameras to record what I was seeing.
The sorts of conditions that the kids were exposed to were barbaric, but they were also, I would describe them as being akin to torture. Children were reporting assaults and batteries by prison guards, but also there were a period of time where children were being kept locked in their cells for almost entire day periods, sometimes multiple days on end.
I ultimately felt that I couldn't continue working in a situation like that was so plainly wrong. One of the most arresting things, I suppose, was that members of the department were totally unfazed by the things that disturbed the rest of us NGO staff.
Another thing that really affects me still to this day is in the inquiry I told people, I told the government, I told the senators, and there's a hard copy of what I have written. Men were getting infections starting in their feet because of lack of shoes and the unsanitary conditions. And they were getting quite severe, so they were getting big abscesses and open wounds and cuts, and it was all seeping, and there was not enough medical care. And then a couple of months later, Hamid Kazeyi died of septicemia.
I decided that there was also something morally wrong with continuing to work in that environment if I didn't feel that I could actually do anything to protect those kids. So I tried everything I could think of, and I still wasn't able to protect their rights.
One matter that weighed very heavily on my mind and the minds of the mental health nurses, the rape and abuse of several young men. The conditions of the camp were atrocious, worse than third world. As a place of incarceration, it was worse than any prison I'd worked in before.
I found it very hard to get anybody interested in what I had to say. It was too complex. It involved a lot of secret documents. Part of the complexity of my story was worse than just corruption in the Defence Force. It was the difficulties I had trying to get anybody in Australia to care.
There's no opening in the river for you to move through. There's just these walls around, and you're just hitting them from every angle. And none of those people, whether they're a part of the system per se or they're on the side of the system, actually care about what they're sacrificing to keep you silent.
Each staff meeting, we were told, you guys have signed confidentiality agreements with the Commonwealth of Australia. You cannot speak about what is happening here. You will be sued. You face 2 years in prison. They even tried to imply that they were watching our Facebook accounts and that they were in our messages, and we couldn't even talk to our own family about it.
I saw journalists after journalists. I knew that they'd put me in jail. People kept saying to me, you're getting arrested. I didn't care. The idea that they could just say, oh, well, we can break the law, but you're not allowed to talk about that because the Official Secrets Act, that didn't make any sense to me. The Official Secrets Act is to protect the country. If the government starts endangering the country, it no longer applies.
I wrestled with what I should do After I returned, I had signed a deed of confidentiality, as had everyone who worked there, and I was threatened with 2 years imprisonment if I mentioned anything. But I often felt, as I reflected on what I'd left behind at Manus, I often felt I was in my own personal prison anyway.
I was extremely alone. I was suicidal. Once they published a story which was the opposite to what I wanted, and I'd lost my identity, I'd lost my family, I'd lost everything that I believed in. I was certainly very close to killing myself.
Ultimately, it led to an increase in feelings of being trapped, no way out, so on and so forth. Reoccurrences of events that I dreamt about, some irrational fears, hypersensitivity and so on. It led to the demise of my marriage. Would have been difficult living with someone like me, I imagine.
The memories of the abuse, but also the memories of what happened afterwards are held still in my body. When I go to these places, there is sensations constantly going through me. There is a fight to find language to talk. There is an absolute fight to push these words out and to even know that there are words in my head that can come out.
Well, you ask, am I facing jail? Of course. I'm being prosecuted for a jailable offence. Does this worry me? I mean, at my age, I can't sacrifice my values. I have to go with what I believe is right and just. If this government, scared though it is of exposure, believes it can bundle up secrets by bundling me off to jail, well, so be it. So be it. That's the state of our country. We are facing a great test in this country, and bring it on as far as I'm concerned. Just bring it on.
Microphone, thank you. Please round of applause for Hoda Afshar. Dr. Hoda Afshar. Hydroclasty. Here we go. Just, yeah. Should we move a bit closer?
I apologize for the pain. For the pain, it's painful to watch. Even I pain every time I watch it. Yeah.
To call that confronting is an understatement. To call your work inspiring is an understatement. It is quite a bit to take in. And as much as we might be feeling certain feelings, I wanted to acknowledge that you spent hundreds of hours, not just conducting those interviews, but then rewatching those interviews, cutting and editing, sound editing, constantly engaged with that for so long during a lockdown as well. That how many months of lockdown did you go through in total between here in the UK and back again?
I spent nearly 15 months in lockdown. In the last 2 years, I did the whole Melbourne lockdown, and then it started right after I finished filming this project, and then I was sitting in lockdown, transcribing 9 hours of interviews with the whistleblowers and going through it over and over, which I don't think was very healthy for my mind to do. But then I went to the UK for an artist residency, and then I got trapped in there for 7 months in lockdown. I returned hotel quarantine a month later here in Australia. We went back into lockdown again. So it's good to be free.
I just wanted to acknowledge and give another round of applause for the resilience it takes to be able to conduct a project like that.
Thank you.
Resilience is something we're going to probably talk about a bit in this session, but I wanted to start with how the idea to begin the photography project and then the film project came to you to begin with.
Sure. Most of my work is, I work with photography and film, and all of it is around like investigating how image making historically has contributed to the construction of different categories of marginality, and the visual languages that we use are often developed by imperial languages that continues to divide people, or just it's very hierarchical. So it's more like thinking about different methodologies and including collaboration to talk about, issues as such, social injustices, without reducing people to violence and trauma. So I worked with different communities and groups of people, and as you mentioned earlier, in 2018 I went to Manus Island to make work with the refugees who were detained by the Australian government there. And I collaborated with Behruz Buchani, who's the journalist and writer. He was detained there at the time as well. And we made a film and also a photographic series with the men who were detained there at the time. And I remember the last night that I was on Manus, I asked the men that, did anybody who worked here for the Australian immigration system complain about the conditions of the camp and the treatment of the refugees? And they said in the first couple of years, anyone who complained about the situation were sent off immediately back to Australia. They were threatened with 2 years jail time, and they started only hiring people who would actually go along with the system without trying to resist it or change it. At first, when I heard it, I couldn't believe it, that something like that can exist in a liberal democratic system. And when I returned, I looked into it, and then I realized like there's this law, the confidentiality, that people who work for any governmental organization have to sign it. And if they speak about the government's wrongdoing, they face jail time. So it became, the starting point for the project. At first, I looked into people who worked in the detention center because I wanted to make this work as a kind of a mirrored image of the project on Manus Island. One of the things I was testing also at the time with the project I did on Manus was to see what it takes for people here in Australia to hear these people, because at the time there were kids under the age of 10 in Nauru that were committing suicide, because of the psychological trauma that the system put them through. And even that wasn't enough to convince people to do something about it. There were a smaller population who were, vocal about the situation and active, but it was never enough. And so I was wondering what, maybe if people do not respond to the men and women who are outside the Australian border, the migrants, the so-called refugees, maybe they respond to their own people, the Australians who actually witnessed that and tried to do something about it. The idea of people who witnessed other people's trauma and they carry it within their bodies, like the body becomes a museum that preserves and archives other people's traumas. So I wanted to capture that, but then going into the project, the more I heard about other practices like the youth detention centers and then the disability sector, and then I got in contact with, you know, Bernard Collaery, who's the guy at the end of the film. He's a celebrity lawyer of human rights, and he worked with Witness K as a lawyer because he defended Witness K. He's facing jail time too. Or, you know, David McBride, who was the lawyer of the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan, and he leaked 400 secret documents to ABC because he risked his life basically for the sake of public to know that the Defence Force is covering up for the killing of innocent Afghanis. And he's facing lifetime imprisonment, and ABC was raided because of his documents in 2019. So the project has started growing bigger and bigger to a point that at some point I felt like I'm breaking under it because it comes with a lot of responsibility. But it was important for me to bring all these different narratives together because all of these people went to the media at some point and they risked their lives thinking the public needs to know, and if the public knows, they would do something about it. I related to that experience because that's what I did with the Manus project. And then you realize that the public chooses to actively remain blind to it, as one of the people in the film talks about it. So it's the essence of tragedy to me, you know, the people who are caught between the law and morality, and they choose the public and the morality, but then they lose everything over it. So I thought if people are encountering these narratives in the paper or the media as a single story, maybe they don't realize the depth of the problem there. But if they see it all together, it highlights something about the fragile state of democracy in this country, and they may react to it differently.
Has that been the case? How's the response been so far?
The response has been great, but unfortunately it coincided with lockdown after lockdown that the show's been cancelled. The first exhibition was when I was in London, and I wasn't here when it was shown in Melbourne, that we put the photographic work on large billboards in Federation, across the road from Federation Square, and the film was shown in a building across the road, and people were sending images to me of public standing around these billboards with the text of the narratives of each individual and having a conversation about it, which was really exciting to see.
Beautiful. I was going to ask you a little bit about the selection as well. How did you come to find and meet and select each of the people that you photographed and filmed?
It was interesting. At first, I was talking to Behrouz Bouchani about, you know, who to work with from Manus Island, and then he kept telling me that it's very important that you work with the right people, because at some point there were a lot of people who worked for the immigration. They benefited from it. They earned so much money. They offer so much money to people who worked in those detention centers, and they benefited from it. And at the end of their time, they felt guilty, and they decided to go out and get more recognition for speaking out while they actually financially benefited from the system. So he was warning me about like making sure that the people I choose are like people who had, you know, genuine intention about it. It's a very difficult decision to make, basically, but I collaborated with the researcher from Melbourne University, Claire Loughnane, and she is in the area of criminology and social justice, and her last 10 years of research been on whistleblowing and the detention centers and so on. So she helped me a lot in finding the right people. And then I got in contact with Mark Davis, who's the lawyer of lots of the whistleblowers in Australia, including, what's his name, the WikiLeaks guy. Yeah, Julian Assange, and he's the lawyer of Julian Assange too, and he put me in contact with most of the people that I worked with. Yeah.
Incredible. Can you talk us a little bit through the process, your creative process, and why you decided to sculpt and photograph people the way you did, and then to shoot them in that particular style as well, because it's very intentional, obviously.
You know, I thought I want people to directly feel the pain and trauma that is in the body of these people and how it affected the individuals. Basically mocking the language of documentary filmmaking in the cases where, like, often if the documentarian wants to keep the identity of the subject hidden, they get really close to the subject and to they do tight crops. I remember I watched a documentary on the ghost of Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq, and that was the greatest inspiration behind this, actually, where they were interviewing the inmates, the people who were tortured by the American soldiers and humiliated. I don't know if you know about the controversy of the images that leaked, and they were interviewing the inmates, but they were like hiding their identities, and it was very tight close-ups of their faces and hands and the ears, and when they were talking about their experiences in the prison and they were breaking into tears and so on, it was very effective. I wanted to use that visual language. Often I try to use the conventions of documentary, but try to challenge it as well. What's the truth in it? So I use that here as well to, first of all, highlight the fact that if you want to tell the truth, you have to remain anonymous as a whistleblower. But then also to, like, by sharp cuts and jumps, I wanted to highlight the montage aspect, that the truth is constructed. But then I wanted to also stitch all the different pieces of these people's bodies together to present the story as one body, which to me is the body of the society in pain.
And I think some people might be familiar with the photography exhibition, but you went through a fair bit of work to actually come up with those photographs as well. Can you talk us through that part of it? The
portraits that I made of the whistleblowers. Yeah. The project has a second component, which is a series of portraits I made of the men, and I used 3D scanning technology, but I worked with a 3D expert who had 110 cameras installed, and we were clicking one click and 110 cameras were firing at the same time and documenting all the details of the faces of the subject. And the only thing that the 3D technology couldn't record was the details of their eyes, which to me was referencing the identity recognition tools like iris scanning and so on. But then also the 110 cameras to me was a way of talking about the overexposure of the media, but also the surveillance as like the struggle of the people here in the West, to me, is the opposite of the struggle of most minorities like the refugees. They struggle with visibility. I wanted to highlight their identities by bringing them forward. But here we always struggle with too much visibility. We're just constantly being monitored everywhere we go through the surveillance cameras and technology, so we want to become less visible. So in some ways I wanted to bring those ideas into the work, and later the 3D scans that I made of the faces, I modeled them into Greek busts, and they look like Greek statues, printed them 3D and then rephotographed them as museum objects. And so there are layers of the faces and identity that is removed, but by doing that, I wanted to reference the earlier formation of democracy, in Athenian democracy and also Greek tragedy, which were all both shaping and happening at the same time.
Beautiful. So much thought has gone into this. I want to ask you a little bit about the situation you really investigating there, and the interviews you conducted, is a really extreme juxtaposition of the extreme resilience and strength that was necessary to be able to bring the stories out, and then the extreme active silence that was mentioned as well, where they're literally face to face with these atrocities and so many people are actively silent. Whereas in wider society, we might be seeing a not quite contrasted example of the same thing, where there's still active silence and there is still resilience, but it's not quite as extreme. So you actually went to the very source of this inequity, and you saw the extremes of active silence and resilience. Can you speak to us a little bit about why you think this function of active silence is such a big part of our society, whether it's Australian, whether you think it's a global thing? Why do you think active silence is something that comes up so often in these sorts of spaces?
To be honest, I'm trying to find an answer to that question through making these works, because that's initially what inspires me to make it. I don't make work about things that I know or have a knowledge of. I make work about things that I don't know. So through the process of making, I want to understand the matter better. And then what I discover along the way, I share it with others. And I think the works are creating more questions than answering anything, because I wanted, first of all, for people to feel the discomfort and to be faced with our own complicity. And also to, when you watch this, I want you to ask yourself that, what would you do if you were in that situation? Because most of the problems we are facing in relation to social injustices is because the majority choose to remain silent or to remain oblivious to it. It's too much. It's not my pain. I have enough of my own. But I think we all have to acknowledge that people like us, we all have our own struggles, but we are still some of the most privileged people in the world, and part of that privilege has to be shared. And I feel that responsibility, but I want to know that why the majority don't. And I think at some point I see it a lot in like the way that these narratives are pictured and imaged and narrated. And as I said, for me, years of studying the role of images in communicating stories as such as very significant, because they know the way that, for example, we image certain narratives, it's like to normalize their pain. For us today, you know, the Palestinians' death is normalized, the Syrians' death is normalized. If we see an American dying, we react to it very differently than seeing masses of people in Palestine and Syria dying. So it is because of the way that they're imaged and the way that these stories are shared, and we kind of became numb towards others' suffering, especially, you know, people of color and so on, and the so-called third world or the conflict zones. So it's the way that we value these lives, the way that we understand and relate to it. So I think what I'm trying to do is to reverse that to a certain degree in the visual language, or find a way that make people feel things, because we're oversaturated by images of suffering to a point that we feel completely detached from the suffering of others. Yeah.
Thank you. We are going to create some time for questions from the audience. So maybe if we get a microphone ready, and if a hand goes up, we can get it to them. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question of Hoda while Josh prepares the microphone?
Or even
yes, the hand
comments.
shot up right there. There we are. Josh is coming right to you now.
But very thought-provoking film that you put together. My question is about active blindness, because, you know, as part of the general public, whenever we see issues such as this that are far removed from our daily lives, we feel helpless whenever we see that. Yes, we connect emotionally and we wish that things were different. But at the same time, we feel like it is beyond our own agency to be able to contribute something productive to the discussion. Based on your experience, you know, as an artist, as somebody who puts together videos, do you think it is more effective to be able to produce media that's directly confrontational, like more direct in terms of the issues, or do you think it's more effective to put together a story that Trojan horses the issue, to make it palatable and then to deliver it within the story? It's a question. Thank you.
The core of the question, if we can get to the core of the question, you're suggesting, is it better to overwhelm people with stories of suffering, or What's the...
Or based on your experience, do you think it's more effective to just give the matter directly, like what you've shown us, or do you think it's more effective to like hide it within the story and then allow the audience to draw from the story?
I think it really depends on the matter and the issue. Like, but one of the things that I'm very conscious of in the making of these projects is how to talk about violence without showing the violence, because how much of the violence we need to see to be able to respond to it. One of the reasons the death of, for example, Palestinians normalized is because the media's oversaturated by the images of death, dead children and people from there. But then like during the war on terror, it was a law that was passed, but that not even a single American soldier dead is allowed to be pictured. So if you were a photographer sent to Afghanistan, Iraq, the region, you were not allowed to photograph American soldiers dead or bleeding or wounded, right? But then everybody, like the Iraqis and Afghanis, were constantly pictured in those situations. It's the way that we, that's how it's normalized. The image, if you're exposed to so much violence, then you become you become immune towards it. For me here, it was like more about bringing all these narratives that are ignored and bring it together without showing the violence. Here, the violence is imagined. You're hearing the stories without seeing any of the images that the situations they're talking about. So you have no choice but to refer to your own experiences or find something within your own body to relate to it. And that's where it's felt. That's where it becomes effective. That's a methodology that I tried to test out and see if people respond towards it. Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. If you bombard people with like too much suffering and trauma of others, they feel helpless. And I think everyone's got to find their own way of communicating that to their own community and others around them. For me, my tool is my art, and I try to find different ways of telling these stories. And sometimes I fail, sometimes it's effective. I hope it answered.
Time for one more, maybe, if there's an audience question. I think they're still processing it. There is one. Okay, there you go.
Hi, I just wanted to ask whether you think that people have become numb to injustice and violence like this out of necessity. As in to acknowledge, like to truly acknowledge the way we live and the way we run everything is unfair, means that we have to change everything that we do and the way we live. And that can be very scary for some people.
Couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, I couldn't quite hear it. Yeah, just a little louder, closer into the mic.
I'll say it again. Sorry.
That's it.
Yeah, so do you think that people become numb out of necessity because to acknowledge the way we live and the way society is run is unfair, means we have to change everything about the way we live and the way we think, and people are scared of change?
I guess these questions are, I think they're very structural. The reason we are numb also to a certain degree is because I personally think that it's because we're convinced that democracy means individual freedom. It means individuals, like choices. In fact, it's the opposite. When democracy shaped, it was about collective power to people. It was about what works for the society as a whole. And we kind of reversed that. And now it's all about what benefits me, what choices I want to make, what is closer to me. And the further the suffering is, the more disconnected I am towards it because it doesn't affect me. Like, that's why to me sympathy is a very dangerous tool, because you take others' suffering, a piece of it, for no reason. You just hear it, you feel sympathetic, and you feel better about knowing about that matter. But what has changed since you've felt sympathetic? Nothing changes. And what we want is indignation, basically. What we want is solidarity, not even compassion, because solidarity means that you acknowledge that there are sufferings in the world that you would never ever feel or experience, that there are experiences in the world that will never be part of your life experience, but you acknowledge that they're wrong, they're injustices, and you don't want them to happen. You want to stand with the people who are suffering that. So it means that you go outside your own self. The idea of unselfing to me is very important, which unfortunately you see more and more, like the society is being brainwashed through the capitalist systems and so on, that it's all about individuals' choices. While I think the only way to feel responsible or just responsive towards these matters is to go through the process of unselfing, to get outside your own bubble and see others suffering and leave your senses open to that, and then make decisions on how you can act upon it.
It's a beautiful response. Thank you. Just checking time. We are a little bit over, but I was going to ask you one final question. What would you like to leave the audiences here with, and those watching online with, as an outcome of the work? What would you like for them to take out into the world as far as conversation pieces and thoughts with them to be able to implement into their lives and their thinking?
I think what Janet, one of the people in the project, talks about, the idea of active listening, like to choose to actively listen and to think about unselfing. Maybe the two things I can ask for. That's it. But thank you so much for listening and watching.
Thank you, Hoda John. Please, round of applause for Dr. Hoda Afshar.
Thank you.
Definitely one of the most powerful creatives that I've ever had the honor and privilege of speaking with, and I think I can see some heads nodding for sure. For me, art has always been about creating this kind of an impact in the world. You know, oftentimes it's used for self-expression and self-exploration of ideas and whatnot, but some of you who may know a little bit about myself, whereas my family's heritage has always been about the application of the arts for social change. My father's early youth and childhood and teenage and 20 years was all about using the arts for social change, which is why I'm so in love with the work that Hoda does, because that's the reason for it, to be able to create that impact on individuals, to leave that lasting impression, and to create a better world as an outcome of having created something. I've had a conversation with our next keynote, Mr. Irfan Daleri, and we've agreed that because it's been such a jam-packed day and we've been running behind a little bit schedule, the last thing we need is another 30-minute keynote from myself. So we're going to postpone the talk. I'll say a few words at tomorrow's conference welcome. I'll say a couple of words at the conference closing, but there's no need after this fantastic session. I really think there's no need for any more words. Perhaps some refreshments in the foyer and some conversation is all we really need right now. So I'd like to thank you for being here with us live online and here in person. You can still actually attend if you want to join us in person. So tell your friends to come along if you are coming back tomorrow. I'd like to acknowledge all of your resilience and your proactive approach to creating social change. And again, remind us, just as we did in the morning before we leave, we are still living, working, breathing on the stolen lands of the First Nations peoples of Australia. And with that, I'd like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends here present with us and watching online. I pay my respects to the elders, nations, neighboring clans, Bunurong. Thank you, dear friends. See you in the foyer for refreshments. Bye.